Hello, this is louden, and this is my presentation on the Algerian War. So, for background information, Algeria faced 132 years of colonization from France, and it became its colony in 1830. The colonial period in Algeria was marked by violence and injustice, with an undemocratic administration under France. There were very little native Algerian mediators to France, meaning the needs of the people in Algeria were frequently not heard. French seized Algerian lands after a rebellion against French colonization, and this harbored more resentment against the French. And in the early years of colonial rule, 1/3 of the native Algerian population had died. France also systematically westernized Algeria through their schools, their education and infrastructure, and just plain force. So there were, to also set up, there were 3 groups of French nationalists who called for some sort of independence during this era. So the first were the assimilationists, and they were for making Algeria a permanent part of France, but only if native Algerians had the same rights as Frenchmen, and often these people had French educations, so they favored these sort of gradualist and reformist policies as opposed to complete rebellion. The second group were a group of Muslim nationalists who were inspired with the Salafi movement in Egypt, and they fostered a deep pride in Muslim Algerian identity. The third group were a more radical nationalist group, but the most popular, and this group appealed to people who were aware of the French mistreatment against the Algerian people, and they called for total independence of Algeria. So all of these groups fostered different ideologies that really set the stage for the Algerian War. You can cut now.
Hi, my name is Isabel, and this is my presentation on the Algerian War. So for the causation/context, French colonized Algeria from the 1830s to the 1840s. They'd previously been a part of the Ottoman Empire, and this was really just because the French saw that there was a lot of cheap land in Algeria, a lot of availability of jobs, and so they kind of just thought, why not expand? So a lot of local and regional movements sort of broke out. They used a lot of guerrilla warfare tactics to try and fight back against the colonizers. The Second Republic legally incorporated Algeria as part of France in 1848. This divided it into departments, and the Algerians faced a lot of social disadvantages. They could not get their citizenship. They could not vote in elections for representatives in the National Assembly, so they're not getting representation, they're not getting citizenship. Obviously, tension is going to rise. So a lot of repression campaigns in the 19th centuries, lots of brutality in them. I'd like to mention that the French brought a lot of disease, and it caused a lot of the native population of Algeria to decrease. So with the overthrow of Napoleon III, a lot of European supremacy ideas were incorporated. What I mean by this is Napoleon III, he actually encouraged what he calls multiracial empire, and he kind of envisioned that the Algerians would have a lot more autonomy than we're about to find out right now. But with his overthrow, this didn't really seem to be the case. And yeah, European supremacy was still very much preferred over multiracial empire. Okay, so going back to the French, seeing that there was a lot of cheap land in Algeria, as you can probably infer, this land was not going to be spared equally or correctly. French settlers did own a lot of the most fertile land that they could make money out of, and they owned about 21.5 million acres of land, compared to Muslims who had the not so good land, and they actually owned about 18.5 million acres of land. So we can obviously see there is a really big jump between the land ownership. The French did want to assimilate Algeria to be very similar, if not just like them. Same religion, same culture, same practices. They were denied citizenship. They could not vote for representatives in the National Assembly. So with World War I, A lot of Algerian men were recruited to fight in it, and it was there that they were actually exposed to a lot of anti-French propaganda. Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination, which essentially just said, hey, like, nations should have the right to govern for themselves, and a lot of European nationalism. So with that, they were like, hey, like, I'm feeling inspired, let's kick French rule out of here. So following that, the Sétif massacre actually occurred. French police, they attempted to confiscate paraders who had banners holding "Long live free and independent Algeria." This infuriated a lot of people because hey, we're just protesting. And I'd actually like to mention the formation of the FLN. The FLN was a revolutionary organization composed of Algerians, and they pretty much just fought for Algerian independence and to be free from French rule. A lot of rampages, bombings, and ships firing on coastal towns. Even torture, actually. The FLN would be tortured by the French military in exchange for information or just to show, like, a sense of power. So not only that, but the two-college system was implemented. This basically said that the French Algerians and Muslim Algerians would elect separate but same equal-sized delegations. This made no sense because there were way more Muslim Algerians than French Algerians. So with that being said, the standard of living for Algerians began to decline a lot. The French were like, hey, we're investing to the colony, but really there was still a lot of high unemployment rates. There was high illiteracy in Arabic and a lot of high inflation as well. And this actually drew a lot of Muslim Algerians to move from rural areas to more urban areas. So this actually caused them to find more affordable places to live within the urban areas, and a lot of them ended up in like slums, shanty towns, places where standard of living is not very good. However, on the positive side, a lot of radical groups formed. As I mentioned earlier, the FLN, started by 9 Algerian men who their goals were traditional Islam, a left-wing agenda, and complete independence of Algeria. They got a lot of their inspiration when the Battle of Dien Bien Phu happened, as French forces, they were defeated, and they were defeated by the colonial people, the Vietnamese forces, so that gave them a lot of inspiration, like, hey, like, we can essentially kick out the French. So actually, after the Vietnam War, a lot of Algerian men, they returned, and with that, a lot of them were now able to join the radical groups such as the FLN, so they grew in power, they grew in size, and they could now, with more manpower, they could plan a lot more and be a lot more effective. So for the course of the war, as we know, the FLN is getting a lot stronger. They're getting a lot of new members from soldiers who fought in the Vietnam War. So this is when they launch a bombing campaign that essentially starts the war, November 1st, 1964. The French are sort of ignoring this, but minor bombings just continue to follow up. And this is actually when France held an assassination campaign against FLN leaders. So they're quickly starting to notice the FLN is getting traction, popularity, and is not going to back down. So the FLN began terrorizing the Pieds Noirs using our favorite guerrilla tactics, guerrilla warfare, their favorite way of attacking. This is when the FLN implements the idea of collective responsibility as well. This was towards the Pieds Noirs. Again, these are the French and French Algerians and their descendants. And they're like, hey, we're blaming all the Pieds Noirs for things, the suffering that we're enduring. We're blaming all of you, collective. So, in 1955, the terror campaigns carried out by the Pieds Noirs resulted in more Algerians joining the FLN, so they're only gaining more popularity. And French efforts in the conflict began to intensify after they realized, hey, FLN isn't backing out. Like, we need to take this more seriously. So France began moving those suspected of supporting the FLN away. So limited economic reforms were kind of used to, like, hey, like, distract, calm citizens, and the French used helicopters to root out FLN fighters, so they definitely had the resources to do this. The Battle of Algiers occurred when the FLN moved the war to the city, and this is attempting to gain attention and support through terror attacks. Moving to these more urban areas, these cities, it made it harder to find hiding spots for these FLN fighters, which led to a lot of them being captured, and torch would be used to pull out information from these French soldiers This actually led a lot of the French population to come to dislike what was going on, as they were seeing just how brutal this was. Around this time, France also constructed the Maurice Line. This was basically saying, like, hey, even though we granted independence to Tunisia and Morocco, we're going to put this fortified barrier between you guys because we want to contain these the FLN fighters who have their central commands based in Tunisia and Morocco. So this is just like, hey, we're going to make your life harder. So France started the Battle of the Frontiers. This was a conflict that the FLN's army was losing, unfortunately. When France transitioned from the Fourth French Republic to the French Fifth Republic, this brought a lot of rise to President de Gaulle, which he was viewed very badly by the Algerians. They did not like him. They kind of just associated him with violence and brutal tactics associated with the war in general. He proposed the Shell Plan, implemented it as well. It involved urban renewal, concentrating troops in the north, moving west to target weak spots, and increasing naval patrols. The strategy was pretty successful. The ALN did cause a substantial amount. With the FLN losing a lot of their soldiers, a lot of their numbers, they still continued these terror attacks. And I think it was at this point that President de Gaulle was like, hey, I don't think these guys are backing down. And he eventually put the issue of Algeria's status up to a referendum. This was after the Evian Records, which was basically just an agreement between France and the provisional government of the Algerian Republic that said, hey, ceasefire, we're ending this war. So the Pieds Noirs were a little mad about this. They temporarily put barricades in protest, but later took them down. I think they were scared that their supremacy would be gone in an instant, and it was. De Gaulle recognized the freedom and independence of Algeria, and with the Evian Records having been established, this guaranteed the safety of all French citizens and officially granting Algeria its independence.
So for results, the Evian Accords were the accords that granted Algeria independence, and it also ended the Algerian War and called for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the war. So the negotiations occurred between France and the FLN, or the Front de Libération Nationale, and these were the four main points in the Evian Accords. So the first was the treatment of the French population, or the Pieds Noirs, in Algeria, and the rights that the Algerian government would give them, and also the sovereignty of the Sahara due to the oil deposits in the region. So who would control them, France or Algeria? The status of France's nuclear test sites and military bases in Algeria, the framework of negotiations between France and Algeria in the future. So, continuing with the results, threats of violence came from the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, or the Secret Army Organization, and this was due to the Evian Accords because this sort of militaristic group actually wanted to keep Algeria as a colony, and did not want its independence, so the Evian Accords were against their values. So the French president at the time, Charles de Gaulle, was nearly overthrown by this group, and this raised political tensions, and it raised more questions on independence for Algeria and how it had divided the nation. So on March 18th, 1962, the Evian Accords were finalized, and after much negotiation, the French would not claim sovereignty over the Sahara in exchange for rights to the oil reserves in Algeria. So, to continue, the French thought they had given up too much in the Evian Accords, and the Algerians believed that not enough was taken away from the French, so this created a sort of divide and displeasement on both sides. And on the 1st of July 1962, the Algerians were polled on whether they wanted Algeria to be an independent nation, and due to overwhelming support of independence, the French President Charles de Gaulle recognized Algerian independence only 2 days later. So, the French Fourth Republic was the administration for the first few years of the Algerian War. The Fourth Republic was overthrown by French nationalists, who believed that they were being too soft in Algeria and that harsher actions were needed. And the Fourth Republic was replaced by the Fifth Republic under the most popular past general and political figure, Charles de Gaulle. And so around 650,000 people fled Algeria after it gained its independence from France, and this included Algerian Jews, Harkis, or native Algerians who fought on the side of France, and the Pieds Noirs, or the French settlers in Algeria. And many of these people faced violence and discrimination in Algeria, or they were just wishing to repatriate to France. And along with this, Harkis were Algerian Muslim soldiers who served on the side of France, and they faced severe violence due to them being on the losing side and fighting against their country. So, post-war Algeria had faced severe political instability. The FLN was left in control of Algeria, but didn't have the fraction of the power that the military had post-independence. So really, the military controlled everything. So Houari Boudinnier